a history of Catholic social justice. So in the first 1900 years of our church, we'd be hard-pressed to point to documents that speak about social justice. So as Catholics, we started various institutions, orphanages, hospitals, schools, but we weren't thinking so much about Catholic social justice until the turn of the 19th, from the 19th century into the 20th century. 1891 was the real first papal encyclical that dealt with social justice. We refer to it as Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum, written by Pope Leo XIII. What was the context in 1891? Okay, we had this church, this pre-Enlightenment church, which somehow survived the Enlightenment, this period when people were starting to ask questions about our world and being more skeptical about the things of the world and the things of the church. So there were various cultural changes that resulted in it. There were political changes. Think of the revolution that we had here in the Americas, right? Before, in Europe, we were obedient to monarchs, and suddenly we see all these monarchies being overthrown. Whew, these present certain challenges for us. Because we're shifting as a world now that we're at the end of the 1800s. We've shifted from this world of monarchs and kings and queens to this world of democracy, so that it's no longer these special people wearing crowns who are over us and higher than us. Instead, it's those of us who are living in a democracy, all of us professing that we are equals, shaping our own futures. This presents a challenge for the church. So there was the political climate that had changed, the liberal revolutions of 1848 in France, Germany, Italy, Austria, Poland, and the Netherlands. There was the French Revolution and the American Revolution back in the 1700s. All these movements toward democracy with their declarations of rights, etc. Think the U.S. Constitution, how it is that people have certain fundamental rights. For instance, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So in the medieval world, before the Enlightenment, the two great forces were the emperor and the pope. And now that the world was changing, the focus was less on the emperor and the pope and on individuals. In addition to the cultural changes and the economic changes and the political changes, there were also economic changes. We were introducing new economies in the world, one of the most significant of which we refer to as capitalism. Capitalism simply meaning instead of spreading our goods, right, if we were socialists say, okay, if we produce 3 crates as a group of people, we work today and produce 3 crates, then how do we distribute those 3 crates? That's not capitalism, that's socialism. Okay, capitalism is whoever builds the crates and sells the crates, they get the money. Interesting. So if I'm going to lead the building of the crates and the selling of the crates, maybe I'm going to hire Deacon John and I'll give him $1 for every crate that he builds for me. But then I turn them around and sell them for $12 each. Ooh, wait a minute, right? That raises certain questions about justice based on the economic models that we now have. Leading that change was Adam Smith and his book, The Wealth of the Nations, written in 1776. It was a defense of capitalism and free markets for social betterment. There was a move toward the cities. There was a move toward industrialization. And so it was Adam Smith who said that our self-serving wills will eventually serve the common good, in this concept that he referred to as the invisible hand. That our markets are controlled by this invisible hand. Because, for instance, when Father Jamie tries to sell his crates for $12 each, what does that mean? That if another person comes along, Andy, selling his crates for $9 each, then suddenly there's going to be an adjustment on the price, because suddenly people are going to ask, why should we buy Father Jamie's crates for $12 when we can buy Andy's crates for $9 or Becky's crates for $7? Different economic changes, and the church is taking a look at these and trying to figure out, okay, what does this mean for us as a church? In the light of these challenges, then, the church at first had this fortress mentality where they saw what they called liberalism as evil. They were condemning the evil of liberalism and of progress. But then by 1891, Pope Leo XIII is saying, instead of this fortress mentality, we've got to be thinking through what's our stance as a church going to be with respect to these social issues, with respect to these political, economic, cultural realities around us. So it was Pope Leo XIII and Rerum Novarum then who suggested that we need to engage the world and its structures. The world has certain political and economic structures. We are part of those structures. We need to engage those structures. He pointed out how it is that sometimes those structures are unjust. So if those political or economic structures oppress certain people, if there are unjust structures, then those structures matter to the church. In our church every Sunday, we have people who are benefiting from structures and other people who are oppressed by structures. How do we as a church begin addressing those issues through the lens of our faith? And so Pope Leo XIII suggested that the fortunate, those who've been blessed, right, those who are selling the crates at such a profit, they have a responsibility to those who are not so well off. Think about that for a moment. Talking about the just distribution of crates. Rather than me keeping all the crates to myself, okay, how do we more justly distribute these crates? Pope Leo XIII also suggested that the laity should be involved in social activity and activism, simply meaning if we are in unjust structures, what does that mean for us? That we have a duty, an obligation to help change those structures for the sake of those who are oppressed. Do we see the radical nature of what's happening here? It used to be that we as a church were structured hierarchically with the Pope at the top, and we tend to have these also in society. But when the pyramid fell over in society, and began to in the church as well, we started thinking, okay, if there are unjust structures, we need to challenge them and we need to change them. How interesting that he was referring to the unjust situations in society, not so much in the church. It would take until the Second Vatican Council for us to start raising questions about the unjust structures of the church. How a church, for instance, could exclude women from ministry. That was Pope Leo XIII in 1891. Flash forward 40 years later. 40 years later, it was 1931, and the Pope at that time, Pius XI, wrote another encyclical called XXIII Anno, which in Latin, in English, means 40 years. XXIII Anno, the 40th year. So now, we wrote this.
What does that other one mean?
Good question. Rerum Novarum means new things. So he's talking about new things that sprung up in this world, new systems. How are we as a church? What are we going to do about these new things? Rerum Novarum, 1891. On the 40th year.
Rerum Novarum?
Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum then was the first social justice teaching of the Roman Church, of the Western Church, to which we are heirs. 40 years later, we finally see another work about social justice. It was probably Pius's idea. He said, you know what? It's been 40 years since we said something about social justice issues. What do you think? Shouldn't we as a church be saying something about these issues again? So in 1931, he began addressing the condition of workers. Interesting, another social justice issue. If there are workers in this world who are being oppressed by systems, especially capitalist systems, then something is wrong with this. He discusses the ethical implications of the social and economic order. He describes the major dangers for human freedom and dignity arising from unrestrained capitalism. So essentially, Pope Pius is looking across the ocean, let's just be honest, looking at the United States, seeing our system of capitalism and what's happening with it, how it is that the rich are becoming more rich and the poor are becoming more poor, or are remaining in poverty. Wait a minute, something is not right about this situation. For those of us here in Austin, Texas, the example that's closer to home was the economy furniture strike. What happened in the Mexican and Mexican-American community here in Austin? Finally, the light bulb went off that, you know what? They just kept raising the amount that we needed to produce, the amount of furniture that we needed to produce, and they were not paying us anymore. Follow me? They kept raising their expectations, not paying us anymore, until we finally said, this is enough. It's not right for simply the owner of the company, the person at the top of that pyramid, to be earning all of the money that's being made off of these pieces of furniture that we are all making. So the dangers for human freedom and dignity arise from capitalism. He called for the reconstruction of a social order based on the principle of solidarity and subsidiarity. Solidarity, how it is that, all of us are together in this. Think of the solidarity that arose out of the economy furniture strike. When all those workers decided to strike together, that was the power of it. Pope Pius was simply pointing to that same reality, that we as a people need to act together. If one person goes on strike, we can replace that one person. If we all act together, la unión hace la fuerza, right? Unity creates strength. That was Pope Pius the 11th. His successor, Pope Pius XII, 1939 to 1958, followed the dates. Who was the Pope during World War II? Pius XII had the infamy of living through that and trying to appease various world powers during that period. It was Pope Pius XII then who began to address the rights and dignities of patients. Think about that for a moment. If you're in a doctor-patient relationship, if you go into a hospital, that you have certain rights, you have certain dignity. He addressed medical responsibilities, the moral implications of psychological illnesses, which was radical for that time period, the uses of psychopharmaca, drugs, uses of medicine in terminally ill persons, the right of family members to make decisions against expert medical advice. The doctor says you should do one thing, but we as a family decide to do something else. What we're seeing here is the Pope is writing on these issues. Issues that affect more than just people's spiritual lives. In the Middle Ages, we were just responsible for people's souls. Now we realize, wait a minute, these people are living in a world that at times can be oppressing them or not treating them right. It was Pope Pius XII, for instance, who said that the use of pain medicine in terminally ill patients is justified, even if it may shorten the life of the patient, as long as life shortening is not the objective evil. So you're in pain, you can take this medicine, it will shorten your life, but it will ease your pain. Ooh, think of the dilemma that puts you in, right? And so essentially he's saying, wait a minute, you're not intending to shorten your life. What you're intending is the good outcome, which is the relief of pain. Pope Pius XII also addressed the behavior of medical doctors, facing of pain and death, sterilization, genetics, artificial insemination, back in the 1950s. The multiple moral aspects of medical technologies, the morality of applied psychology, moral limits to medical research and treatment, cancer treatment of children. So you see how it is that the church is stepping into various matters that are outside of theology, but the reason it's doing it is because of the dignity of the human person, those who are being affected by these things. That's Pope Pius XII. His successor is Pope John XXIII, now a saint, has long been a saint in the American Catholic Church, now a saint in the Roman Catholic Church as well. He was canonized the same day as Pope John Paul II. Really interesting, because the Roman Catholic Church with Pope Francis, right, in order to canonize a good, open-minded, loving, liberal, if you will, person like John XXIII, what did they do? They canonized a conservative Pope on the same day. You know, it brought people together. It was amazing. Pope John XXIII was the elderly Pope that we elected because we're thinking that he'd fill the seat for us to give us time to figure out who's really going to be the Pope. What happened? He lived longer than we expected, longer than we hoped, if we were honest. And he also decided to call a council of the church. The last council that was called was 1870. Before that, the last council that was called was in the 1500s, the 1540s to the 1560s. So in 1961, he called the council of the church, brought us all together to talk about issues. John XXIII also wrote on social issues. In his document Mater et Magister, 1961, Mater et Magister is Latin for mother and teacher. Magisterium comes from that word, teacher, right? Also maestro in Spanish comes from magister. Pope John XXIII said, we must work toward authentic community in order to promote human dignity. And so here it is, again, a focus on human dignity. We as a church are going to be focused on the dignity of the human person. He says sometimes the state intervenes in matters of health care, education, and housing, especially with respect to the distribution of resources. Think education. Here in the state of Texas, we tax ourselves to provide a free public education. we believe that's good. Okay, so how are we going to distribute those monies in public education? He was aware, Pope John XXIII was aware of how it is that some injustices could result from the way that we distribute various resources. 1963, in the middle of the Second Vatican Council, he wrote Pacem in Terris. 1963, Peace on Earth was the first ever encyclical directed to not only to Catholics, right? Don't popes just write to Catholics? This was the first time in 1963 the Pope said, I'm just going to write to Catholics, I'm going to write to everyone of goodwill. And in Pacem in Terris, he talks about how it is that, think of the events that were happening back then. If any of us were old enough to remember things like the Cuban Missile Crisis going on at that time. Essentially, the Pope is telling us we're all responsible for world peace, human rights, and moral duties. He's not just writing to Catholics of the world, he's writing to all of us saying we're all responsible. If we're going to keep this world from blowing up, from whatever threats of nuclear holocaust, we've all got to work together for peace and for human rights and for the moral life of our people. Pope John Paul XXIII in that same Pacem in Terris says, we all live in relationship to the collective authority of the state, but all nations should be equals and should foster greater relations, assisting one another, rather than setting up these paradigms where one nation is over other nations. So we talked about the Second Vatican Council, 1961 to 1965. There were a few documents that came out of the Second Vatican Council, including Dignitatis Humanae and Gaudium et Spes. Let's talk about each of those. Dignitatis Humanae, the 1965 Declaration on Religious Freedom. This was a radical document insofar it was simply setting up the principles for church-state relations. We're the church, there are various governments. What relationship should we as a church have to the various governments of the world? In that document, what pertains to Catholic social justice is that this document, the Declaration on Religious Freedom, talks about this context of religious pluralism, where there are many religions. We're acknowledging we're not the only religion in the world anymore. There are many religions, and in this context of religious plurality, liberty is a fundamental human right, especially the liberty of religious belief. Why would we say something like that? Because we don't want other people telling us what we should believe. We did that for years, we know, but now that it's no longer the Pope and the Emperor, we realize that there are more voices. We don't want other people telling us what we need to believe. In that document, the Church acknowledges the freedom of state institutions, of governments, but the Church also sought the freedom to exercise its mission and ministry in the world. Gaudium et Spes, we may have heard of that. Gaudium et Spes was the 1965 Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the modern world. This was a radical document from the 1960s for the Roman Church, because essentially its three concerns were the place and the role of the Church in the world. We're not this fortress mentality anymore, but how are we going to engage the world? Instead of drawing back into our own fortress, instead of walling ourselves up inside the Church, how are we going to engage in the world? Second concern was the Church, how it is that attempts to describe the Church's presence in the world. What is the Church really? And some of the beautiful images that came out of Gaudium et Spes and the works of the Second Vatican Council was saying, for instance, that the Church is the pilgrim people or the holy people of God. Before we were saying things like the Church is the fortress of God, using this fortress analogy. No, we're pilgrim people. We're out in the world. And its other concern is how the Church will teach in the world, because the Church finds itself in this world. So what can we as a Church help to teach the world? Gaudium et Spes suggests that we need to begin with the human person, which simply means that the human person comes first, and the Church needs to safeguard the dignity and the life of that human person. So the primary concern of Gaudium et Spes is the dignity of the human person. So the Church was making the argument that it should attend to institutions that affect human dignity. If a government, a political system, or an economic system affects the dignity of a person, then we as a Church have to say something about that. How interesting, because after the 1960s, what was happening in Austin, Texas, the economy furniture strike, interesting. The priests who were involved in that were reading documents like Gaudium et Spes, saying that if the dignity of people is being affected, we have a responsibility to help them. Where were the workers of economy furniture meeting to plan their strike? They were meeting at the Catholic churches of Austin. Santa Julia, Cristo Rey, that's where they were organizing, because those priests at that time were reading these documents and were being inspired by that, right? Father Frank Briganti was helping to organize workers. He saw too many young ladies coming to his parish with hands that were mangled in the manglers that used to press our sheets. No. We need to organize to change this. Father Victor Gertz, Father Joe Sinadas at Cristo Rey and Santa Julia, right? How it is that they saw these workers who were suffering an injustice in the factory situation in which they found themselves. How do we help them to organize?
Monsignor Rey was one of the captains with them also.
There you go. So how was that these priests were being inspired by this vision of the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes, and began to organize people? This creates a challenge because in the hierarchy of the church, right, when we see our priests starting to get involved in various social issues, it's enough to make some people nervous. How did it play out in the economy furniture strike? Because the head of the factory, what was happening there? He was a donor to the local Catholic hospital. He was a friend of the Roman Catholic bishop. So the Roman Catholic bishop was calling people like Father Gertz saying, ease off, right?
Right.
I know you want to help these workers, but this guy
Mr. Smith is a good friend of mine.
Mr. Smith is a good friend, and he's doing such good for our Catholic hospital. Oh, that's the Second Vatican Council and Gaudium et Spes, right? Saying that we need to, if something affects human dignity, think economy furniture for those of us here in Austin. If anything affects the dignity of those persons, we have a responsibility to do something about that. Gaudium et Spes also said the church should proclaim and witness to the reign of God, which touches all realms of human experience. And so we need to be interested in the protection of human dignity, the promotion of human rights, the deepening of the unity of the human family, the provision of meaning to human work and endeavors, etc. Simply meaning we as a church are not going to be content simply for taking care of people's souls. It's good and noble to take care of people's souls, but if these people are living in oppressive situations and oppressive systems, we have some duty to more than just providing them an uplifting word about the afterlife. We have to focus on this life as well. Gaudium et Spes suggested that the church has something to say to the world, but also that we should be listening to the world. So there's this sort of dialogue, rather than thinking that we know everything and we should tell you how it is on certain issues. No, there needs to be this dialogue. How interesting that got lost quickly after the Second Vatican Council. Pope Paul VI, who concluded the council, he said, we're going to tell you how it is. With things like artificial birth control, the artificial birth control pill will tell you how it is, rather than listening to the wisdom and the experience of others. It was the Second Vatican Council that said, we have something to teach the world has something to teach us. The experience of all those women, all those people who are using artificial birth control, they have something to teach us as well. That got lost. And Gaudium et Spes is probably most famous for saying that the church needs to read the signs of the time. That's a famous phrase from Gaudium et Spes, simply saying the world is changing. The church has got to be able to look at those changes and be able to assess, okay, what about that is good? What about that is bad? The world is changing. We've got to read the signs of the time. 1968, a few years after the Second Vatican Council. So what's going to happen is after the Second Vatican Council, we're going to see the writings on social justice increase in the church. So shortly after the Second Vatican Council concluded in 1965, the next document we're going to see is in 1968 by Paul VI called The Development of Peoples, or in Latin, Populorum Progressio, where he suggested that the economic development of this world needs to be accounting for the quality of life and basic needs of all people. Economic development, right, as our nations get richer, as we get better off, wait a minute, we need to be thinking about the quality of life and basic needs of all people and not just some or not just ourselves. It was Pope Paul VI who said that nations have a history of political colonialism, which simply means that there's a history of certain nations hoarding resources and keeping those resources from others, keeping other nations poor. His concern again was human dignity. And he also suggested that if the Christian claim that we are one family is true, we all say that we're one family, we're all brothers and sisters. Okay, if that's true, if we are really brothers and sisters, then we need to be looking out for one another rather than this growing gap between the rich and the poor, right? Especially of those who are privileged, hoarding all the crates to themselves and keeping others down. No, wait a minute. We need to take a look at how it is that if we're all brothers and sisters, we need to be looking out for one another. 1968 then was Populum Progressio by Pope Paul VI. That same year, all of the bishops of Latin America, of the Spanish-speaking countries of the Americas, met together in Colombia, in the city of Medellin, and they started formulating what we today know as Latin American liberation theology. So these Latin American bishops in Medellin in 1968, it was the first time that bishops of South America came together to try to interpret Vatican II in their context. Okay, they're reading documents like Gaudium et Spes. What do these documents mean for us as bishops of South America? Especially when we're on this continent, the Americas, where some people, the United States, are becoming rich, and those of us south of the equator are not benefiting from that. So it was the Latin American bishops who suggested that economic development had failed and that South America continued to be oppressed by wealthy nations. Think about that for a moment, right? They were so indebted to us, we held their debt, we were charging them interest. All the millions of dollars of interest that we're charging, there's no way that they could ever dig themselves out of the poverty that they were experiencing because of what they owed to nations like the United States of America. Whew, what a condemnation. Their contention was that we as a church need to be a church of the poor. Think of the example of Jesus. Who did Jesus reach out to? Who does God reach out to in the Hebrew Scriptures? The Lord hears the cry of the poor. As bishops and as a church, we need to hear the cry of the poor. So their contention was that the church needed to have a preferential option for the poor, simply meaning if you're going to have favorites, who should your favorites be? Poor and those who are less privileged. If we're going to be distributing these crates, right, who should get preferential treatment? The poor. Those who need those resources the most. And so that council at Medellin, that meeting of bishops, that synod, resulted then in Latin American liberation theology. How it is that the church would remain relevant in the face of all of this poverty, in the face of all of these unjust social and political and economic structures. And how interesting that later other conservative popes, think John Paul II, think Benedict XVI, how it is that they would declare these liberation theologians as being outside the faith of the Catholic Church.
Pitiful.
Pitiful indeed. Talk about a sad condemnation.
They oppose the liberation theology,
Exactly.
contraception, abortion,
Exactly.
homosexuality, divorce, everything.
Unconscionable.
And this guy Joseph Ratzinger, wasn't he the next pope?
He was.
Pitiful.
Oh, sends a shiver up my spine. That brings us to John Paul II. So after Paul VI, we had this very brief, roughly 30-day tenure of a pope, Pope John Paul I, for those who remember him, wasn't in office very long. John Paul II, long time as pope. Right? From 1978 to 2005 then, John Paul II, and remember that his right-hand man was Joseph Ratzinger, who'd become the next pope, right? They often referred to Ratzinger as the Pope's Rottweiler, simply meaning, I mean, they were two very conservative voices in the Western Church, in the Roman Church. They opposed liberation theology and reaffirmed the Church's opposition to contraception, abortion, homosexual activity, divorce and remarriage, etc. Simply meaning all of that renewal that we experienced in the Second Vatican Council, they started talking about, we refer to that as the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. They started talking about the reform of the reform. 2,000 bishops came together and tried to let some fresh air into the church, attempted a reform of the church, and then they attempt a reform of the reform.
So all the work that Pope Pius XII And Pope John the 23rd, you know, almost went like down the drain with these two guys.
I remember as a young priest, one of the issues that came before us here in the Roman Catholic Diocese of Austin, the bishops sent out a letter, right? It's come down from on high. Pope Benedict XVI decided that you can no longer use chalices made of anything except precious metals, right? What is wrong in a poor country, think Latin America, what's wrong with using a chalice made of clay, a pottery chalice at Mass? Is there a problem with using a pottery chalice or a wooden chalice or a crystal chalice? Those of you in this world who use crystal chalices, is there any problem with that? Pope Benedict XVI said, no, you can only use precious metals. Because for God's sake, Jesus, after all, at the Last Supper, I bet he was drinking out of a gold cup. Right? We've all seen Indiana Jones and the, what was it, the Temple of Doom, I believe it was, where he comes to a room filled with all of these, no, it was Indiana Jones and the
Last Crusade.
the Holy Grail, yeah, something like that, where essentially, you know, which one of these cups would Jesus have used? Would he have used the gold one or the silver one? Pope Benedict XVI is saying, no, all of your chalices have to be precious metals.
After so many years of good leadership, you know, why would they elect these guys?
Excellent question, and part of it is, so John Paul II was elected as a very young pope. He was in his 50s. I mean, you can imagine the older ones of us looking around and saying, oh, he's young, he'll be able to lead us toward this vision that we had. Not the case. Even Joseph Ratzinger once was a very liberal young man. He wrote a book questioning the resurrection. Right? Resurrection, is it a myth or did it really happen? Interesting that these young men started out one way and really led the church in a very other way. For instance, John Paul II was famous for saying the push for same-sex marriage, which we see in the United States this month, wait for the court ruling coming out the week after next. The push for same-sex marriage is part of a new ideology of evil. Laborem Exercens in 1981 is his encyclical on human work, talks about how work is integral to human nature and its dignity should not be degraded. Talks about issues of labor, capital, the importance of people over things. A family wage, nice. We talk about just wages, what it is we should be paid. Pope John Paul II, to his credit, was advocating for family wages with benefits. He talked about unions assisting the positive struggle for social justice. So there is some good, and of course he lived through a lot of that in Poland as well, right? The social revolutions that were happening in Poland. Talked about the dignity of agricultural work. How does the persons with disabilities have the same rights as other workers? So it's really interesting to see how it is that one person can hold such contrasting views within him or herself. On the 20th anniversary of Populorum Progressio, which we had noted before, Populorum Progressio, he wrote then the Solicitudo Rei Socialis in 1987. We translate that roughly as social concern. Talks about concern for the poor, reform of the international trade system, reform of unjust structures, global solidarity. How fascinating that at the same time he's writing about concern for the poor, they're condemning Latin American liberation theologians. There's a bit of cognitive dissonance in all of this. 1991, on the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, remember that, Pope Leo XIII. On the 100th anniversary now, we write Centesimus Annus, meaning the 100th year, which again talks about the dignity and the rights of workers, the rights to establish professional associations of employers and workers, labor unions, the right to private property, the right to a just wage, the right to defend and to promote the dignity and rights of human persons regardless of personal convictions, regardless of what you believe, we have an obligation to defend your rights. Solidarity, how it is that if we're all brothers and sisters, we need to recognize that. Subsidiarity is an interesting principle, how it is that a community of higher order shouldn't interfere in the internal life of a community of a lower order. So that, for instance, the Diocese of Austin shouldn't interfere in the parish life of various parishes. That's called subsidiarity. Taking care of things at the lowest possible level.
They do that, don't they? They don't get too involved, or do they?
They don't get involved unless they need to. So subsidiarity is an important principle. in many settings, right? In other systems, think, for instance, public school systems. If you have a problem, do you go directly to the board? No, you work it out, right? You work it out at the lowest possible. Talk to the teacher. If that doesn't work, talk to the principal, right? It's how it is that we try to work these things out at the lower levels, rather than depriving those lower levels of their function, right? If the diocese took over all the issues, wait a minute, right? That's not building the structures that we want to see. So how interesting that on the one hand the Pope is advocating for concern for the poor, and on the other hand condemning liberation theologians. On the one hand talking about all these social justice issues, and as we see in 1991 with Ordinatio Sacerdotalis on priestly orders, talking about how it is that the church can't ordain women. We know that the church ordained women for 529 years until the Second Council of Orange, but says Pope John Paul II, sorry, the church cannot do this. Jesus chose only men, and so we as a church will choose only men. The other social justice document of John Paul II, Evangelium Vitae, 1995, The Gospel of Life, is an entire document on abortion, euthanasia, and the death penalty, and why it is that those three things are wrong. Why it is that abortion and euthanasia and the death penalty are wrong according to his way of thinking. That brings us to Pope Benedict XVI. So John Paul II, the one that he appointed to look out for the matters of the faith, the Congregation for the Faith, Joseph Ratzinger, later became Pope Benedict XVI. By the very name, it frightened any of us who remember the Church of 2005, because it was Pope Benedict XV who talked about, and he mentioned it in his first sermon as Pope. He said, sometimes the tree needs to be pruned. And what happened? What did we do with those liberation theologians? They needed to be pruned.
Now, excuse me, Father, back up a little bit here on that. Now, it was Pope John, was that third? No. That said that women would not be ordained in church?
Pope John Paul II.
Well,
Yeah.
Pope John Paul II.
That's point number 9, letter F. And he later reaffirmed it, saying that the case is closed. We will not discuss the ordination of women. Benedict XVI then was elected Pope, 2005, took the name Benedict XVI, which led us to believe that he was going to continue the legacy of Benedict XV, ruining the church. How interesting. We had a Catholic journalist who came and addressed the Roman Catholic Diocese of Austin 1 year later on the first anniversary of the Pope being named. John Allen was his name, from the National Catholic Reporter. And he said what was significant about Pope Benedict XVI was how pastoral he was becoming. He was the Pope's Rottweiler previously, and then he gets into the position of Pope, and just when you think that he'd be pruning the tree, as we heard him say in his first homily, he actually, he committed a few faux pas early on, talking about Muslims and people of Turkey and things like that. But once he got over those, he actually turned out to be a bit more pastoral than any of us expected. Deus Caritas Est was his first encyclical. In English, that's God is Love, Deus Caritas Est, in 2005. He talks about how is that social justice is the primary responsibility of politics and laity and should be directed toward charity. Ooh, read between the lines. Who should be involved in social justice? Should the priest the Rey and Santa Julia be involved in social justice? Leave it to politics and the laity. What happened in 1982?
Does it say the laity towards charity?
Yeah. What happened in 1982, 1983, the Roman Church reformulated canon law and said, priests cannot run for public office. Let it stay out, as church stay out of social issues like that. Leave social justice to politicians and laity. It's their primary response. This primary responsibility for social justice falls to them. In 2009, he wrote Charity in Truth, or in Latin, Caritas in Veritate. 2009, Charity and Truth, he talks about the actions of all economic actors being informed by ethics, particularly with respect to such issues as hunger, world hunger, the environment, migration, sexual tourism, bioethics, cultural relativism, social solidarity, energy and population issues, etc. What's interesting is that he's willing to talk about some issues, other issues like the HIV/AIDS epidemic that we had been through, women's reproductive health, the Roman Catholic priest sexual abuse scandal. There's something we don't talk about. We remain
Keep
silent.
it a secret.
Pushing under the
Isn't he
rug.
the one that went to Africa too, and he saw the people dying and all that? And then he kind of acted like contraception might help him. But then he got back to Rome and changed his mind and said, no, bullshit.
An interesting thing, how it is that the bishops in Africa were actually giving out condoms to the people. Why? Because we believe that this is good. People are dying of sexual diseases. Better to give them what they need to prevent that. And yet the church's hardline stance of 1968, Humanae Vitae,
Yeah.
1968 was
You told
no.
me before said that,
It is intrinsically evil. That brings us to Pope Francis, who is a new pope, so he's only 2 years into the job, elected in 2013. But how interesting that Pope Francis, from Argentina, comes from this context of Latin American liberation theology. He went to the seminary before all that happened with the bishops gathering in Medellin. So he was a priest who was formed and ordained before Vatican II, but he's seen all of these changes in the church, and he's seen it from the Latin American or South American perspective. His first papal encyclical on social concerns was The Light of Faith in 2013. In Latin, Lumen Fidei, the light of faith. How it is that faith should play a role in building societies that are interested in the common good. The good of all people, or the good of all people is forefront in our minds. So all of that simply to provide us a bit of context on the evolution of social justice thinking in the Western Church, to which we are heirs. So in the American Catholic Church, in the independent Catholic movement here in the United States, we are heirs of the Western Church. We're not heirs of the Eastern Church. We're heirs of the Western Church, which is the Roman Catholic Church. So these are the documents closest to the context within which we minister.